This is United States History 201, Presentation 22, Secession. So we're going to talk about the end of the 1850s, the 1860 election, and of course the secession of the southern states, which will bring us to the beginning of the war in 1861, and we'll talk about that in the next presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. The 1860 election is probably possibly the most contentious election in American history. It's often misunderstood by most Americans. There were actually four major candidates vying for the presidency. The Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln of Illinois. There was a Northern Democratic candidate, Stephen Douglas of Illinois, a Southern Democratic candidate, John Breckinridge of Kentucky, and a Constitutional Union candidate, John Bell of Tennessee. So what happens, of course, is the Republicans, which are a purely Northern party, are going to nominate a guy that they think can get Southern votes. Abraham Lincoln, of course, originally born in Kentucky, but was now resident of Illinois, but he was seen as a moderate, and so they hoped that maybe he could swing some Southern votes. It wasn't going to happen. In fact, Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in most Southern states, but it's a possibility in their mind, anyways. The Democratic Party is going to split. Stephen Douglas of Illinois appeared to be the front runner. He waited his time, bid his time, waiting for the nomination. But Southerners were not going to accept his nomination because of the Freeport Doctrine, which we talked about in the last presentation. So when he gets the nod, Southern Democrats bolt the convention and form their own convention and nominate the vice president, John Breckinridge of Kentucky, as the Southern Democratic candidate. And then finally you have Whigs, Know-Nothings, people of that stature, American Party members who were not necessarily satisfied with the Republican Party. They nominated John Bell of Tennessee, again, Constitutional Union. They weren't going to take the strong Southern position, but they weren't going to accept the Republican position either. This was a moderate conservative party, with the attempt being to hold the Union together. So I just mentioned this. Douglas unpopular in the South due to his continued insistence on popular sovereignty. I have to mention this. There were only 20 slaveholders and 46 slaves in the Western Territories in 1860. So what they're battling over here is slavery extension. 20 slaveholders and 46 slaves. It's not a whole lot of slavery in the West. So Webster was probably right that slavery wasn't going to be viable in the West, but it was principle that the Southerners were worried about here. The Republican Convention of 1860 was unlike any thus far known in national history. This is what historian Alan Nevins said. It was greater in size and enthusiasm and noise and wire pulling and self-righteousness and lust for office, and in its blend of mass hysteria and idealistic fervor. So what you're looking at here is a party driven by ideology. A party driven by ideology. So they're not concerned about practical issues. The America they love is the America in their head. If they can't get that, then there's going to be problems. And Lincoln was a compromise candidate. He had few political enemies, was regarded as a conservative Republican, and he appealed to old Whigs in the Henry Clay mold. So there was an opportunity there, they thought, to get more votes. 1 week before the Republicans met, a splinter party comprised of conservative Whigs and Know-Nothings nominated John Bell on a platform of uncompromising support for the Constitution and enforcement of the law. The party hoped to pull conservative votes away from the Republican Party and minimize the potential effect of a Republican victory in November 1860. Everyone knew that secession could happen, so they were hoping that wouldn't happen if Lincoln doesn't win. Of course, the results, Lincoln gets 180 Electoral College votes and a little under 2 million votes, total votes. Douglas gets 12 Electoral College votes and a little under 1.4 million votes. Breckinridge gets 72 Electoral College votes and a little under 1 million votes. And then Bell gets 39 Electoral College votes and a little under 600,000 votes. So Lincoln received less than 40% of the popular vote and not one vote from the southern states. So what you have now is a purely sectional candidate as President-elect of the United States, and this is not going to sit well. So on December 20th, 1860, an elected convention in South Carolina passes an ordinance of secession rescinding the 1788 ratification of the Constitution and, in effect, removing the state from the Union. Now, President Buchanan, who's still in office, declares secession illegal but does not use force to stop it. So what we have here, in fact, after Lincoln's election, there was a federal judge in Charleston who just basically took off his robes and said, "I'm done," because they thought this was the end of the Union of the Founders. Buchanan eventually will try to use force, but a little bit too little too late to try to keep South Carolina in the Union. But overall, you have a popular elected convention, the people of South Carolina, those who could vote, elected a convention, and in a overwhelming majority, in fact, unanimous, the people of South Carolina say they want to leave the Union. This was a larger popular vote than what you would have had in 1776 when the states left the British Empire. And I've given you a link here to the South Carolina Ordinance of Secession, so you can read it in the Declaration of Immediate Causes. They do list slavery as one of the driving factors in secession, but I think their greatest fear, again, was the continued minority status of the South in the Union. If you think back to early in the course, we talked about how the North was agitating for this and was talking about the exact same thing. They're never going to have political power here. And that was South Carolina's fear. And the South's fear overall. So it's just moved from one section to the other. This brings us to what's often called Secession Winter. December 20th, 1860 to April 12th, 1861. 7 states would secede from the Union to form a new government, the Confederate States of America. But the question is, was war inevitable? Could war have been prevented? And most importantly, what was Abraham Lincoln's role in the commencement of hostilities? And could he have stopped the war? Was war inevitable? Absolutely not. Could it have been prevented? Absolutely. And Lincoln's role was one of an agitator, not a compromiser, not someone who was trying to save the Union or stop war. He wasn't dragged into the war. He wanted the war. So, there were attempts to compromise. In fact, the Senate formed something called the Committee of 13. Republicans continually rejected compromise during secession winter. Though compromise on the slavery question of the territories would have saved the Union. In fact, there was a very famous compromise proposal called the Crittenden Compromise, which was proposed by John Crittenden of Kentucky. And the Committee of 13 voted it down 7-6. But on this committee, there were 8 Democrats and 5 Republicans. And the chairman of the committee, Jefferson Davis, had already determined that they had to have dual majorities. So you had to have at least 3 Republicans and at least 5 Democrats to make any of this work. So when all the Democrats support it, which was 8, and all the Republicans are against it, Davis and Toombs of Georgia switched their votes and vote against it because they didn't want it to be a Democrat proposal. So the Republicans were being told by President-elect Lincoln, don't compromise. Essentially the issue here again is extension of slavery into the territories, which there were 20 slaveholders and 46 slaves. But the idea was to protect the common property and to ensure that the South and the original Union, where the North could not, or the federal government by default couldn't really interfere with the states, was going to be honored. And I think that there was a fear that was not going to be the case. The Washington Peace Conference would meet in 1861, but it was ineffective. You had a lot of conservative individuals. For example, former President Tyler was there. But these were people who were trying to come up with a solution. It must be said that the American public probably would have accepted any of these compromise proposals and avoided war. There were very few who were on both ends of the spectrum who wanted either secession. At this point, I mean, there were a lot of secessionists in the South, don't get me wrong, but as far as the secession happening while these things were going on, I think that the states that seceded after South Carolina could have been persuaded to stay in the Union. And definitely in the North, the majority in the North would have been against war at this point. So the sad thing is the Lincoln administration, the incoming Lincoln administration, was privately urging Republicans to reject all these efforts to compromise, and of course that led to the war. Now, Republicans consistently chose party over union. Had a compromise plan been adopted, secession certainly would have been averted in all southern states except South Carolina. And the slavery issue in the territories would have been settled. So that would have destroyed one of the main planks of the Republican Party and in essence destroyed the party itself. So Lincoln would have been a one-term president and marginalized. He could not compromise and save his party, but he could have saved the Union, his professed goals. So I think we need to be very critical of Lincoln here. Because if his goal is to save the Union, he could have done it even before he took office by saying, look, compromise. We'll compromise, let's save the Union, but the party goes away and then Lincoln's out after one term and that's it. So secession will spread because of this. Mississippi will secede in January 9th, Florida January 10th, Alabama January 11th, Georgia January 19th, Louisiana January 26th, and Texas February 1st. So by February 1st, 1861, there were 7 states out of the Union. And they formed what's called the Confederate States of America in Montgomery, Alabama in February 1861. They formed a provisional government, wrote a constitution. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi was elected president. Alexander H. Stephens of Georgia vice president. And both of these guys were actually moderates. Davis only left the Senate when Mississippi seceded. Alexander H. Stephens actually argued against secession in Georgia when they had their secession convention. But again, these secession conventions, through crushing majorities, chose to leave the Union. Larger majorities than what you would have had, again, in 1776. So the people overall in the South, this was purely democratic. This was not some type of coup where power was seized by a few radicals. This was a democratic process. Conventions were elected. The people chose to leave the Union, not just a few political leaders. And in fact, fire eaters such as Robert Barnwell Rhett and William Lyons Yancey are absent from the government. Yancey would eventually get a diplomatic post, but this is a very moderate government. It's not led by the men who were calling for secession even into the 1830s. So the Confederate States Constitution will be written about this time, and it sought to remove or reform the ambiguous and contentious sections of the United States Constitution. And in reality, the Confederate States Constitution should be considered part of American constitutional tradition. And most importantly, part of the so-called anti-federalist tradition of 1787 and 1788, because what they try to do is remove the things that the anti-federalists said, well, look, if you do this, this will happen, that happens. So they're trying to make these things work. So the nature of the Union was first and foremost described in the document. In fact, they basically put the 10th Amendment into the document, but all powers are expressly delegated. Each state retains its sovereignty and independence. There was a de jure prohibition of the Hamiltonian system in the Constitution. So by law, the Hamiltonian system would not work because it's illegal. The executive and judicial branches are slightly different. The executive branch is given a one term for 6 years, so no chance of re-election. You get 6 years instead of 4. The judicial branch is interesting. It was actually never put into place. It was never organized. So the state courts essentially handled the entire judicial functions during the war. The necessary and proper and supremacy clauses were not removed. And people would say, well, why not? I mean, these were two of the biggest problems. Well, that's true. But when you put the 10th Amendment into the document and you say that each state retains its sovereignty and independence and only the powers expressly delegated are there, then you're getting to a situation where these things will not become problematic anymore. And there were differences in slavery. Slavery was protected in the Confederate Constitution in the states where it existed. The federal government could not interfere with it, but that didn't mean the states couldn't. And they actually still had the 3/5 compromise for slaves, but free blacks were counted as one whole person. So there were some differences here, but the Confederate Constitution did allow for non-slaveholding areas to enter the Union if they wanted to. It's just the central government could not interfere with slavery. So Lincoln takes command in March of 1861. He actually sneaks into Washington, D.C. There are threats of assassination. D.C., of course, is sandwiched between two southern states, Maryland and Virginia. And so the question becomes, what would Lincoln do? In his first inaugural address, he emphasized he would enforce the laws. And this is a sharp departure from Buchanan. Buchanan did try to enforce the laws at one point, but again, his plans were foiled. But the question is, could Lincoln have saved the Union? Could he avoid war? Absolutely, but he chose not to. In fact, the central focus is going to be federal forts and property. Fort Sumter being the most important in South Carolina. The commander of the fort was Major Robert Anderson of Kentucky. He refused to surrender Sumter to South Carolina. Confederate commissioners were sent to Washington, D.C., and they're authorized to purchase the fort. But they're dangled on a string by Lincoln and William H. Seward, the Secretary of State. Seward is actually feigning sick, refusing to talk to these guys. And their sole purpose was to settle the debt of South Carolina and buy federal property in the state. And if they had been able to do that, there's no war. In fact, Lincoln, almost as soon as he took office, begins polling his cabinet on provisioning the fort. And his cabinet is resolutely against it at first, but eventually by March 29th, he gets his wish for sending a relief expedition. And of course, he knows this would cause war. On April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter is fired upon by South Carolina forces, which are the first shots of the war. Now, Lincoln's highest-ranking general officer, Winfield Scott, suggested that provision was unnecessary. He advocated something called the Anaconda Plan. Basically, you set up a blockade and you choke out the South, which is essentially what won the war for the North. Lincoln, though, understood what would happen should he order a relief expedition. Two things. Either if the South lets the fort be provisioned, their stand looks weak, And if the South fires on the fleet and the fort, causing war, Lincoln suggested the South started the conflict. And so it's a win-win for the Lincoln administration. In fact, Lincoln handwrote the note informing South Carolina Governor Francis Pickens that the fort would be supplied, though he didn't sign it. Lincoln said he had personally conceived the idea of provisioning the fort, and that his plan, these are his words, succeeded. They attacked Sumter, it fell, and thus did more service than it otherwise could. So, if it did more service, this is exactly what he wants. So was this the action of a man who wanted peace and desired to save the Union, or was it a man who wanted war? He called then for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. At that point, the Upper South will secede. These people were not out of the Union yet. This is what Seward was saying. Look, we still have the Union. We've only lost 7 states. They'll eventually come around. Winfield Scott was saying this. Look, if we just let them go, eventually they'll come around. And probably would have over time. Maybe not. But either way, if they don't come around, then you just have 7 states out of the Union. Now, Virginia would secede in April 1861 after they had already rejected secession one time before, but once Lincoln called up troops, they weren't going to fight against the South. Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina would secede in May. There were other southern states, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. These states could not secede. In Maryland, anyone who was pro-secession, the state legislature was arrested. In Delaware, when Maryland didn't secede, Delaware could not secede. The state refused to call a convention. They did have Confederate commissioners there, and the Senate was a little more pro-South than the House of Representatives, or the House in the state of Delaware. But if Maryland had seceded, Delaware might have considered it, and eventually they were occupied by federal troops. Kentucky and Missouri had large pro-Southern populations. In fact, both would secede. There would actually be 2 different governments in Kentucky and Missouri. So they would secede, but again, both areas were also under federal occupation, the federal heel. So this was a very difficult situation for the border southern states. And there was support for secession from the Indian tribes in Oklahoma. The Cherokee were behind the South, and this is because the South gave them a non-voting place in the Confederate Congress, and they were promised that should the South win, their land would be left alone. And of course, after the war was over, the tribes are severely punished by the federal government during the Indian Wars.